The congregation of 5,000 at Victory Dominion Church in Lagos watched in stunned silence as their senior pastor, Prophet Emmanuel, made his wife kneel at the altar during Sunday service and begged the congregation for food money because, according to him, she had been lazy and irresponsible with household finances. Sister Grace Adelik, First Lady of the church, knelt there in her expensive lace iro and buba that her husband had bought to maintain appearances, her head bowed in shame as Prophet Emmanuel held the microphone above her and declared that she needed to learn humility, that pride had made her wasteful, that the congregation needed to see what happens when a woman forgets her place. He placed a small metal offering bowl in front of her and told the congregation that anyone who felt moved by the Spirit could drop money for Sister Grace so she could feed herself that week since she had squandered the housekeeping money he'd given her. The cameras that live-streamed every service to their 200,000 online viewers captured everything. Her trembling shoulders, the tears falling on the red carpet, the congregation's uncomfortable shifting in their seats, the ushers looking away because they knew something the congregation didn't know, that Sister Grace had never been irresponsible, that she had never squandered anything, that in fact she had no access to any money at all because 3 years ago Prophet Emmanuel had taken everything from her, every naira of the 28 million her father had left her when he died, had transferred it all into his name, had used it to build the very church building they sat in now, and had been starving her slowly, systematically, for 3 years while preaching prosperity to thousands. But what Prophet Emmanuel didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he humiliated his wife that Sunday morning, was that Sister Grace had finally had enough, that she had spent the last 6 months carefully, quietly, gathering evidence, and that in exactly 7 days on the next Sunday morning, she would walk onto that same altar and destroy him so completely that his name would become a warning. A cautionary tale whispered in churches across Nigeria about what happens to men who use God's name to abuse their wives. Where are you watching from? Lagos, Abuja, maybe Port Harcourt or London? Drop it in the comments because this story is going to shake you. And I need to know where in the world people still believe that evil doesn't always win. 10 years before that Sunday morning humiliation, before the megachurch and the cameras and the cruelty, Grace Okonkwo was a 26-year-old pharmacist working at a hospital in Ikeja, living a quiet, stable life in the small 2-bedroom flat her late father had left her. Grace was the only child of Mr. Benjamin Okonkwo, a retired civil servant who had worked for 35 years in the Ministry of Education, saved every kobo he could, invested carefully in some land in Lekki before the area became expensive, and left his daughter comfortable when he died of a heart attack when Grace was 24. Grace wasn't rich, not by Lagos standards, but she was secure. She owned her flat, had 28 million naira in fixed deposits that generated monthly interest, had her pharmacy job that paid well, and had been raised by her father to be independent, educated, and careful with money. She was beautiful in that understated way. Medium height, dark smooth skin, natural hair she wore in simple styles, a quiet smile, the kind of woman men noticed but found slightly intimidating because she seemed so self-sufficient, so content in her own space. Grace had been raised in church. Her father had been a deacon at their small Anglican church in Surulere, and she had inherited his quiet, steady faith, the kind that didn't need to be loud or performative, the kind that showed itself in how you treated people when nobody was watching. She met Emmanuel Adelik at a pharmacy conference in Abuja. He wasn't a pastor then. He was a pharmaceutical sales representative for a multinational company, 29 years old, tall and handsome with a smile that seemed to light up rooms, always impeccably dressed, always carrying himself with a confidence that made people want to be near him. He had approached Grace during the networking cocktail hour, had complimented her presentation on antibiotic resistance, had made her laugh with stories about difficult hospital procurement officers, had seemed genuinely interested in her work, her thoughts, her life. They exchanged numbers, and what started as professional courtesy became something else. Phone calls that stretched late into the night, weekends where he would drive from his base in Abuja to Lagos just to take her to dinner, conversations that felt easy and natural, like they'd known each other for years instead of months. Emmanuel had been charming and attentive in a way Grace had never experienced. He remembered small details she mentioned, showed up with her favorite chin-chin from a specific vendor she'd mentioned once, asked about her father, and seemed to genuinely care when she talked about still grieving his loss. He had even attended her church a few times when he was in Lagos, sitting beside her during service, holding her hand during prayers, seeming so sincere in his faith that Grace's church community had approved, had told her she'd found a good man, a godly man. They got married 8 months after they met. A beautiful traditional wedding in Grace's family compound in Anambra State, followed by a white wedding at her Anglican church. Nothing extravagant, because Grace didn't believe in wasting money on one day when that money could build a future. But it was lovely, intimate, filled with people who genuinely cared about them. Emmanuel moved to Lagos permanently, got a transfer to his company's Lagos office, and they settled in a married life in Grace's small flat. And for the first few months, everything seemed perfect. He was supportive of her career, helped with housework, talked about their future, about eventually having children, about building something together. Then things started to shift, subtly at first. Emmanuel began going to different churches every Sunday. He called it research, said he was searching for a church that preached the true prosperity gospel, that their Anglican church was too traditional, too stuck in old ways, too focused on suffering and sacrifice when God wanted his children to prosper. Grace hadn't minded initially. She thought it was just a phase, that he would settle eventually. But Emmanuel's church hopping became more intense. He started watching sermon after sermon from prosperity gospel preachers on YouTube, quoting them constantly, talking about seed, faith, and covenant wealth, and the hundredfold return. His personality began to change. The humble, attentive man she'd married became consumed with this idea that he was destined for greatness, that God had called him to ministry, that he was supposed to be a prophet, a man of power and influence. Grace tried to be supportive. She listened when he talked about his calling, even though something in her spirit felt uneasy about the way he talked about ministry, like it was a business opportunity rather than a service to God. But she loved him, wanted to believe in his dreams. So she encouraged him when he said he wanted to start a small fellowship in their living room, even help him set up chairs and prepare refreshments for the first few people who came. The fellowship grew quickly. Emmanuel was a gifted speaker. He had that charisma that made people believe, made them feel like God was speaking directly through him. Within 6 months, they had outgrown the flat and were renting a small hall in Acacia. Within a year, they had 200 members. Emmanuel had quit his pharmaceutical job to focus on ministry full-time, and they had registered the church officially as Victory Dominion Church, with Emmanuel as founder and senior pastor. Grace continued working at the hospital, her salary now supporting both of them since the church offerings were still small and inconsistent. But she didn't mind. She believed in what Emmanuel was building, believed that he was genuinely called by God, believed that the sacrifice was temporary, that eventually the church would be stable enough to support them both. Then her father's land in Lekki sold. The area had developed rapidly, become one of the most expensive parts of Lagos, and the small plot her father had bought for 3 million naira 15 years ago sold for 55 million. After taxes and agent fees, Grace received 42 million naira, combined with the 28 million she already had in fixed deposits. She suddenly had 70 million naira, more money than she'd ever imagined having, enough to secure her future completely. She told Emmanuel about the sale over dinner, excited, thinking they could finally relax financially, maybe buy a small house, maybe start thinking about children now that money wasn't so tight. But Emmanuel's reaction had been strange. He'd gone very quiet. His eyes had gotten this intense, focused look, and then he'd smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes and said they needed to pray about how to use this blessing wisely. The next morning, Emmanuel told Grace that God had spoken to him in a dream, had told him that the money was a divine seed that needed to be planted into the ministry, that if Grace would sow this seed in faith, God would multiply it 100-fold, that this was her test of obedience, that this was how God was going to elevate them from a small church in a rented hall to a mega ministry that would impact nations. Grace had hesitated. Something in her father's voice seemed to echo in her mind. Her father, who had always taught her to be careful with money, to save, to invest wisely, to never put all her eggs in one basket. But Emmanuel had been persuasive, had prayed with her for hours, had shown her scripture after scripture about seed faith, had painted such a compelling picture of what the church could become with proper investment. a building of their own, television broadcasts, international conferences, thousands of souls saved, and Grace, who loved her husband and wanted to support his calling, who had been raised to be a submissive wife, who genuinely believed God could multiply what was given in faith, had agreed. They went to the bank together. Grace signed the papers to break her fixed deposits, signed the papers to transfer everything into a joint account. And then within a week, Emmanuel had transferred all 70 million naira out of the joint account into the church's account with himself as the sole signatory. When Grace asked why it wasn't staying in their joint account, Emmanuel had explained patiently that it needed to be in the church account for tax purposes, for transparency, that she needed to trust him, that they were one flesh, so what belonged to him belonged to her anyway. Grace had accepted this explanation, had tried to quiet the small voice of doubt, had reminded herself that Emmanuel was her husband, a man of God, someone she should be able to trust completely. The 70 million naira transformed Victory Dominion Church. Emmanuel bought land in Lekki, built a massive church building that could seat 5,000 people, installed professional sound systems and cameras for live streaming, hired a full staff, launched a television broadcast, started holding conferences that attracted people from across West Africa. Within 2 years of getting Grace's inheritance, Emmanuel had built a megachurch empire. He was now Prophet Emmanuel Adelik, man of God, famous across Nigeria, invited to preach at other churches, interviewed on Christian television stations, his face on billboards advertising miracle services and breakthrough conferences. But as the ministry grew, Emmanuel changed. The man who had once been attentive and loving became distant and cold, obsessed with his image and his growing influence. Grace barely saw him anymore. He was always traveling for conferences, always in meetings with church leaders and business people who wanted to partner with the ministry. When he was home, he was different, more irritable, more controlling. He criticized everything Grace did, the way she dressed, the way she talked, the way she managed the house. Nothing was ever good enough. Then the financial control began. Emmanuel closed their joint account, opened new accounts in only his name, told Grace that as the man of God and head of the house, he needed to manage all their finances, that this was biblical order. Grace's salary from the hospital was now paid into an account she couldn't access. Emmanuel gave her a small housekeeping allowance every month, barely enough for food and basic household items. And if she asked for more, he would lecture her about being wasteful, about not managing money properly, about needing to learn contentment. Grace tried to bring up the 70 million naira, tried to ask about returns from the investment, about whether some of it could be returned to their personal savings now that the church was stable, but Emmanuel would become angry, would accuse her of not understanding ministry, of being selfish, of wanting to steal from God, would quote scriptures about wives submitting to husbands, about not touching God's anointed, would make her feel guilty for even asking. Gradually, Grace stopped asking, stopped questioning, accepted the small allowance and the growing hunger, both physical and emotional, that defined her life. 3 years into this new arrangement, Grace was not just financially trapped, she was being systematically starved. Emmanuel gave her so little money that she often had to choose between buying food or buying necessities like soap or sanitary pads. She lost weight. Her clothes hung loose on her frame. She was tired constantly, but she couldn't tell anyone because Emmanuel had isolated her, had convinced her to quit her hospital job 2 years earlier, claiming that as the First Lady of a Megachurch, she needed to focus on ministry work, had moved them from her small flat into a mansion in Lekki that was technically owned by the church, so she had no claim to it, had made sure all their assets were in his name or the church's name. Grace had gone from being an independent woman with 70 million naira to being completely dependent on a man who treated her like a burden. But Emmanuel wasn't content with just financial abuse. He needed to humiliate her publicly, needed to show the congregation and the world that he had complete control. So he started these public shamings. Every few months he would call Grace to the altar during service and make her confess some supposed sin or failing, that she had been prideful or lazy or rebellious or wasteful. The congregation never questioned it. They saw Prophet Emmanuel as infallible, heard only his side of things. assumed Sister Grace must really be struggling with these issues. Some of the women in church even pitied her, would whisper prayers for her deliverance, never knowing that the deliverance she needed was from her husband. The Sunday morning when Emmanuel made Grace beg for food money was the breaking point. Kneeling on that altar with a begging bowl, cameras live streaming her humiliation to thousands. Hearing her husband tell the world she was irresponsible and wasteful when he had stolen everything from her and was starving her deliberately. Something inside Grace cracked open, not in weakness, but in clarity. She realized with absolute certainty that this would never stop, that Emmanuel would continue to abuse her, would probably escalate, that if she didn't act, she would either die slowly from this treatment or lose herself completely. That afternoon, after the service ended, after the congregation had dropped their small donations in her begging bowl totaling maybe 8,000 naira, which Emmanuel immediately took, claiming he would manage it for her. After the church had emptied and Emmanuel had left for a meeting with some wealthy church partners, Grace sat alone in their mansion and made a decision. She would fight back, but she would do it carefully, strategically, using the very systems Emmanuel thought he controlled. Grace still had one thing Emmanuel didn't know about: her father's email address and passwords that she'd kept access to. Her father had been meticulous about record-keeping, had kept digital copies of every transaction, every document, every agreement, including the original documents showing that the 28 million naira fixed deposit had been in Grace's name alone, that the 42 million from the land sale had been paid to Grace directly. She also still had access to her old hospital email, where she'd forwarded herself copies of her employment records and salary slips, proving she'd had income that Emmanuel had taken control of. Over the next 6 months, Grace became strategic in a way she'd never been before. She started recording conversations with Emmanuel using her phone. She documented every time he denied her food money, every public humiliation, every threat. She contacted a lawyer through a women's rights organization, a sharp woman named Barrister Ngozi Okoro, who specialized in cases of domestic abuse and financial exploitation. Barrister Ngozi explained that what Emmanuel had done was potentially criminal, that taking someone's inheritance through coercion and false pretenses could be prosecuted as fraud, that financial abuse was grounds for divorce and restitution. But they would need substantial evidence, and they would need to be prepared for Emmanuel to fight dirty. Grace gathered everything. Bank statements she secretly printed from Emmanuel's computer when he left it unlocked. Church financial records that showed the 70 million naira had been used to build church property that was registered solely in Emmanuel's name, not the church's corporate entity. Recordings of Emmanuel admitting he controlled all her money and gave her an allowance. Testimonies from former church members who had witnessed the public humiliations and were willing to speak. Photographs documenting her weight loss and physical deterioration. Medical records from a doctor who examined her and confirmed malnutrition. Everything was compiled into a legal case file that was devastating in its thoroughness. But Grace knew that legal action alone wouldn't be enough. Emmanuel had built his entire brand on being a man of God, a prophet, a spiritual father to thousands. His reputation was his power, and if she wanted to truly free herself and prevent him from doing this to anyone else, she needed to destroy that reputation publicly, completely, undeniably. So she planned something that would expose him not in a courtroom where he could spin and manipulate, but in the one place where he thought he was untouchable, on that altar during Sunday service, in front of his congregation and his cameras. The Sunday morning came, exactly 7 days after Emmanuel had made her beg for food. Grace woke up early, dressed carefully in the expensive lace outfit Emmanuel had bought her for appearances, did her makeup to cover the hollowness in her cheeks, styled her hair, put on the jewelry Emmanuel insisted she were to look prosperous. She looked every inch the first lady of a megachurch. But inside she was steel, focused, ready. Service started as it always did. Worship, announcements, offering time where Emmanuel preached about seed faith, and people lined up to drop envelopes of money. Then Emmanuel began his sermon, pacing the altar with his microphone, his voice booming about breakthrough and elevation, about God rewarding the faithful and punishing the disobedient. He was in his element, 5,000 people hanging on his every word, cameras capturing his every gesture. He had no idea what was about to happen. Grace stood up from her seat in the front row. Normally, she sat quietly through entire services, never drew attention to herself, but today she stood and started walking toward the altar. Emmanuel paused mid-sentence, surprised, slightly annoyed at the interruption. "Sister Grace, please sit down. We're in the middle of the sermon," but Grace kept walking, her heels clicking on the tile floor. The congregation stirring with curiosity, Emmanuel's face showing irritation now. "Sister Grace," I said. "Sit down. This is not the time." Grace reached the altar, walked right up to where Emmanuel stood, and for the first time in 3 years, looked him directly in the eye without fear, without submission, just cold determination. She reached for the microphone, and Emmanuel instinctively pulled it back. "You will not disrespect this altar, Sister Grace. Sit down now." But Grace didn't sit. Instead, she pulled out her own small microphone from her bag, a wireless one she'd bought specifically for this moment. Turned it on, and her voice filled the church through the sound system. "Good morning, Victory Dominion Church. My name is Grace Okonkwo Adelik, and this morning I need to tell you the truth about the man you call Prophet Emmanuel." Emmanuel tried to cut her mic, signaled frantically to the sound technicians to kill her audio, but Grace had planned for this, had paid the head sound technician the night before to ignore any instructions during the first 10 minutes of her speaking, had shown him some of the evidence she had appealed to his conscience as a young man who had watched her being humiliated for years. The sound technician had agreed. So when Emmanuel gestured to kill her mic, the young man just shook his head and kept her volume high. 7 days ago, Grace continued, her voice steady and clear. "My husband made me kneel at this altar and beg you for food money. He told you I was irresponsible and wasteful. He made me humiliate myself in front of cameras and 5,000 witnesses. What he didn't tell you was that for 3 years he has been starving me, controlling every naira I have access to, giving me barely enough to survive while he lives in luxury." The congregation was dead silent now. Emmanuel was standing frozen, his face showing the first cracks of panic. "Grace, you don't know what you're doing. Stop this now." But Grace continued. "What he didn't tell you was that 10 years ago, before this church existed, before any of you knew his name, my father died and left me 70 million naira. Emmanuel convinced me to invest that money in the ministry. Convinced me it was God's will. Convinced me that as his wife I should trust him completely. He transferred all 70 million naira into his personal name, not the church's name, his name, and used my inheritance to build this building you're sitting in, to buy the cameras that are recording this, to build the empire that made him famous." Grace pulled out a folder from her bag, started holding up documents to the cameras. "These are the bank statements showing the original deposits in my name. These are the transfer records showing Emmanuel moving all the money out of our joint account into his personal church account where I have no access. These are the property records showing that this church building is registered in Emmanuel Adelik's personal name, not Victory Dominion Church's corporate entity, meaning he could sell this building tomorrow and keep every naira, and there would be nothing anyone could do about it. My father's money built this ministry, and Emmanuel has been treating it as his personal property while telling me I have no right to question him." Emmanuel tried to grab the documents, tried to physically stop her, but Grace stepped back, kept talking, her voice growing stronger. "For 3 years I've been financially abused, emotionally abused, publicly humiliated, and spiritually manipulated by a man who uses God's name to justify cruelty. He gives me 2,000 naira a week for food, and when I lose weight from hunger, he tells the church I'm lazy and irresponsible. He has isolated me from my friends, made me quit my job so I'd be completely dependent on him. He takes my salary that still gets paid into accounts I can't access, and he stands at this altar every Sunday preaching about prosperity while deliberately impoverishing his own wife. I have recordings, I have medical records showing malnutrition, I have testimonies from people who have witnessed this abuse, and as of this morning, I have filed a legal case for fraud, financial abuse, and restitution." The congregation erupted. Some people were standing, shouting questions, some were crying, some were already leaving. Emmanuel's face had gone from shock to rage. "You will pay for this," he hissed at Grace. "I will destroy you. Nobody will believe you over me." But Grace just smiled, a sad, tired smile. "They already believe me, Emmanuel. Look at the cameras, look at your live stream. 200,000 people are watching this right now. The videos are already being shared. Your reputation is already over." and tomorrow morning I will be at the police station filing criminal charges. Barrister Ngozi Okoro is already waiting with the documents. Several journalists are already writing stories. By tomorrow evening, all of Nigeria will know exactly what kind of man you really are. Emmanuel lunged at Grace then, tried to grab her, to silence her physically, but several men in the congregation, men who had watched her humiliation the week before and had felt uncomfortable about it, men who had heard enough in the last 10 minutes to understand they'd been deceived, rushed forward and blocked him. Security, Emmanuel screamed, "Get her out of here!" But the security men, who had also been paid by Barrister Ngozi to protect Grace during this moment, stood between Emmanuel and Grace, forming a human barrier. Grace turned to face the congregation one last time. "I'm not telling you this for revenge. I'm telling you because there are probably other women in this church right now experiencing similar abuse, being controlled financially by husbands who use scripture as a weapon, being told that submission means accepting cruelty, being isolated and starved and humiliated while everyone around them believes the husband's version of reality. I stayed silent for 3 years because I was ashamed, because I believed I had failed as a wife, because Emmanuel convinced me that questioning him was questioning God, but I'm done being silent. And if my story can help even one woman recognize that what's happening to her is not God's will, then this humiliation, this public exposure, will have been worth it." Grace walked off the altar, walked down the center aisle while the congregation parted like the Red Sea. Some people reached out to touch her arm, to whisper apologies and support. Others just stared in shock. Emmanuel stood at the altar screaming that she was lying, that she was a rebellious Jezebel spirit, that the congregation should not believe her. But his voice sounded hollow now. Desperate, the cameras had captured everything. The evidence Grace had shown, Emmanuel's violent reaction, his threats, his panic. Within hours, the videos would have millions of views. Within days, Emmanuel's face would be on every news channel and blog. Within weeks, he would be arrested for fraud and financial abuse. The church would collapse. The building would be seized as proceeds of crime. Emmanuel's ministry would be over. Grace walked out of Victory Dominion Church that Sunday morning into the Lagos sunshine. She had no home anymore since the mansion was church property. She had no money since Emmanuel controlled everything. But Barrister Ngozi was waiting in a car outside with a plan: emergency housing, a court order freezing Emmanuel's accounts, a media strategy to counter his inevitable smear campaign, a path forward. And Grace, who had been starving and powerless and humiliated, felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. She felt free. She felt strong. She felt like herself again. And as she got into that car and drove away from the church built with her father's money, she whispered a prayer, not for revenge, not for bitterness, just thank you, God, for giving me the courage to stand. Thank you for reminding me that I was never as powerless as he made me believe. Thank you for this beginning.